like I mentioned, we're going to start looking at the brain. We're going to start off with some of the basic structures. So we're going to look at the brain anatomy, and then we'll talk a little bit more about each one of these structures in a little bit more detail. After we go through some gross anatomy, we'll start off with looking at something called the cerebrum, which is going to be the outer portion of the brain. And remember that we have integration that's going on in the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. We have sensory information coming in, and then we have some sort of plan to execute coming out of the central nervous system. Okay, so a motor response generally is what we're talking about here. All right, so we could break up, the nervous system by anatomy. So central nervous system, remember, it's composed of the spinal cord and the brain. We've talked already about the spinal cord. We're going to focus in on the brain for the next today's lecture and the next lecture. And in the peripheral nervous system, you guys are going to take a look at some of the cranial nerves in lab. And we'll have and we've already looked at spinal nerves. And the other, part of the motor output that we're going to look at after the exam is the autonomic nervous system. So whose effectors are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and some case adipose tissue. A lot of the responses that we are not consciously aware of. We'll talk about that after the exam. All right, so hopefully, some of these, first structures are going to ring a bell for you guys. We're going to talk about the coverings, or the covering of the brain. It's going to be eerily similar to what we talked about when we talked about covering of the spinal cord. And then we're going to talk about cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. And then we're going to go into each one of these structures in a little bit more detail after that. We're going to spend, the first part of this looking at the cerebrum. And so the diencephalon, as well as some other structures, are buried inside the brain. Okay, and I'll show you guys a little bit of what that looks like in just a second. And the brain stem is down here, which leads to the spinal cord, so it's continuous with the spinal cord. And the cerebellum is this guy on the posterior part of the brain. Cerebellum, literally translated, means small cerebrum. All right, so meninges, hopefully you guys remember this, right? So remember the spinal cord had meninges. What were those 3 layers of the meninges? Remember? Yeah, so starting most superficial and then getting closer to the nervous tissue. We had dura mater, and then underneath that we had the arachnoid mater, and then closest to the nervous tissue, tightly associated with it, is the pia mater, right? Anybody remember what dura mater literally translated? Tough mother, right? And then arachnoid mater is going to have extensions that kind of look web-like, and pia mater, does anybody remember what that? Soft or gentle mother, right? And so that's a delicate covering of the nervous tissue. And so you can kind of see this when we look at a cross-section here. You can see that the pia mater is closely associated with the nervous tissue, and then this with kind of spider-like projections, guess what layer that is? Arachnoid mater, right? And then here, the dura mater, the only slight change between the dura mater and the brain and the spinal cord is that the dura mater that covers the brain actually has 2 layers to it. And so that's why you can kind of see these 2 layers. One of those layers is closely associated with the surrounding osseous or bone tissue. The other layer is more closely associated with the underlying arachnoid mater. All right, so yeah. So hopefully, this rings a bell for you guys. And this space, right, that's underneath the arachnoid mater, anybody remember what that name is? Subarachnoid space. All right, subarachnoid space. I'm going to find that's pretty important because we're going to see that that's one of the places where cerebral spinal fluid is found. All right, so looking at the brain, if you open up the brain, you can see in here, in the interior, there's some openings. Right? There's an opening in here. All right, so there's actually cavities or openings that we call ventricles in the brain. All right. Now they're not just empty space; they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. All right, and so here you can see some of these, a little bit challenging to see just on a lateral view here. I put a lot of links up on Blackboard for you guys, so be sure to check it out. There's some that are pretty good at showing the ventricles from a variety of viewpoints. So here we've got ventricles. There's a third ventricle and a fourth ventricle. And then the lateral ventricles were the first two. So if you're ever wondering where ventricles 1 and 2, they're the lateral ventricles. Now, all of these openings that contain cerebral spinal fluid are connected to each other. All right? So these lateral ventricles are going to be connected to the third ventricle, which is connected to the fourth ventricle through this cerebral aqueduct. Okay. So all these ventricles are connected to each other, and what's not shown on here is that the cerebral spinal fluid in these ventricles also is going to be able to flow through that subarachnoid space and also bathe the spinal cord. Now, within these ventricles, all right, is a major site of production of the cerebral spinal fluid. It happens in specialized areas that are called the choroid plexus. Okay, so the choroid plexus. So you're going to see that word plexus used over and over again. It just means network, right? So we're going to talk about, you guys have seen spinal nerves. You know, there's plexuses there. They're called like the brachial plexus and cervical plexus and so forth. There's also in the cardiovascular section, we can talk about a network of blood vessels. And so, you know, that word plexus just means a network. All right. So just keep that in mind. All right. So formation of cerebral spinal fluid, and what does it do? Well, it's going to be important for making sure that the nervous tissue is provided nutrients, but also it's going to be important in removing waste so that nervous tissue can function properly. The other thing is that since the brain is going to be basically floating the cerebral spinal fluid, it means the brain's not directly in contact with the bone, so the cranium, right? Which means that cerebral spinal fluid also offers some cushioning to the brain, because the brain kind of floats. Now, with respect to waste removal, how important are ions in the function of neurons? Well, think about the action potential. That's all about the movement of ions, right? If you have an ion concentration that's out of whack, out of balance, is that neuron going to function properly? Probably not. So electrolyte balance, ion concentrations, are one of the many things that, you know, cerebral spinal fluid kind of helps with. It's not the only thing out there that helps with making sure neurons function properly, right? Right. So here, talking about buoyancy, which is involved with also cushioning, delivering nutrients, removing waste. So it turns out with the buoyancy, it reduces the amount of weight being pushed onto, you know, the brainstem. So if you remember, the hole in the cranium through which the spinal cord originates is called the foramen magnum. And if the brain wasn't floating in the cerebral spinal fluid, gravity would constantly be pulling the brain down and causing contact pressure there. And that can happen with people with certain types of head injury, right? So if you get, say, a subdural hematoma where you get swelling on top of the brain, right, it can push the brain down, and then those individuals have problems with the brainstem. We'll see we'll see the brainstem is really important for some critical functions for life and survival, right? So, buoyancy is actually one of the things that it is important for, as well as some of these other, functions. Now, zooming in on, say, one of these ventricles, we're going to zoom in on a choroid plexus here. And remember, we can have nutrients and waste removal going on, but you can also have that happening here with the choroid plexus even more so. And here's the blood vessels, right? And so here you can get nutrients, CSF production, CSF being produced through filtration, through nutrients coming from the bloodstream, but also you can get removal of any waste products. So here's our nervous tissue up here. So any waste products that are generated in that nervous tissue can be exchanged into the cerebral spinal fluid, and then from the cerebral spinal fluid across these cells into the bloodstream to be removed. All right. So there's constant communication there with the nervous tissue between CSF and the nervous tissue, but you also have this close contact of the CSF with the vascular or circulatory system. Right? Everybody following me on that? So where do we find the choroid plexuses? They're in the ventricles, right? So lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and so forth, right? Now, remember, the cerebral spinal fluid is kind of like it's constantly circulating. So it's not only going through the ventricles and the subarachnoid space, but also bathing the spinal cord, right? So it's taking care of making sure that all of the nervous tissue has optimal operating conditions. Is what it helps with. All right. So the cerebrum, the anatomy, the cerebrum is going to be really this outer portion of the brain. Okay, the outer portion of the brain. You can see here that, there's an inner portion, the deeper portion of the brain. Okay, and I'm going to show you guys, and then we'll take a break. I want to show you guys, I think it helps to see how the brain develops in a neonate, so neonatal brain development, to understand how the brain looks when we're adults. What ends up happening as brain develops in neonates is that it starts off kind of like a tube, and then eventually the anterior part of that tube comes in and it folds around itself. So you got a kind of an outer portion, which we kind of call a cerebrum, and then you have an inner portion, right? And that is going to be really important and includes structures such as the diencephalon and so forth, which we'll talk about. Okay? And so one of the additions I did kind of late was put in this link to this video up on Blackboard for you guys. You don't necessarily have this URL in your PowerPoint, but it's up on Blackboard. All right? And so I just want to show a few minutes of this, the first few minutes, to give you an idea of what's happening during development, so you understand what the structure of the adult brain looks like, or how it became to be like that.
This tube differentiates into the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the spinal cord. The forebrain will develop into the cerebral cortex, which translates sensory stimulation. It also controls complex behaviors, thoughts, memories and problem solving. The midbrain will develop into a neural relay station for sending information from the body to various sides of the brain. The hindbrain will control the most basic physiological processes, such as breathing and heart rate. The spinal cord is the pathway that conveys information from the brain to the rest of the body. Between weeks 4 and 8, the embryo grows rapidly and the face becomes recognizably human. The eyes at the side of the head begin to migrate forward, and two distinct hemispheres of the cerebral cortex emerge. Between weeks 8 and 26 of the fetal stage, the cerebral cortex grows to become a midbrain. By week 28, a major structural change begins. The cortex expands greatly in surface areas and becomes wrinkled and folded inside the skull. Beginning at week 28, continuing through week 40, the brain surface fills with hills and valleys, called jawline and sulci. These cerebral folds and wrinkles help to create a vast neural network, which allows the brain to become a highly flexible yet precise control center and processor of information.
So the point there is just to have you guys take a look at how the brain develops, how it gets its shape and form that we see as adults. All of the kind of details, you don't necessarily need to know. But I hope what you guys saw is that it starts off kind of like this tube, and then the tube kind of folds back on itself, right? Which gives us that, anatomy or that shape that we see the adult brain, right? And so here, starting off as a tube, and then what we had is this part of the brain, if I can take it out, this part of the brain kind of folded back on this part of the brain during development. All right, and so this is the part of the brain that we're going to talk about first, which is the cerebrum. All right, okay, so why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then after the break we'll talk more about particular structures of the cerebrum. All right, so I think we'll continue our discussion. The first part of the brain that we're going to focus in on is the cerebrum, which is kind of this outer portion of the brain. So we're going to eventually dig deeper and take a look at some of these deeper structures, and then also look at the cerebellum and the brain stem here, all right, a little bit later. Okay, and so here we're going to focus on just this outer portion, which is the cerebrum. The cerebrum can be broken up into areas and also lobes. So let's talk about the lobe distinction first. So first is that we have 5 different lobes, 4 of which we can see easily on the image and on this brain. So one is the frontal lobe. Hopefully that makes sense to folks, right? So if you remember some of the bones of the cranium, right? So the frontal bone is over here, so the frontal bone. The next lobe that is posterior to that is going to be what's called the parietal lobe, okay? And the very posterior part is called the occipital lobe, right? So who remembers what bone that was on the very posterior part of the brain, or inferior part? It was the occipital bone, right? So it's the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, right? So we talked about, all right, frontal, parietal, occipital, and then if you take a look, this kind of yellow-colored one here, this yellow-colored one, so what bone is on this part of your head? Temporal bone. So this is the temporal lobe. And then the last lobe that you can't see, but if we were to kind of pull apart the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, we could peer in a little bit. And there's a last lobe that's in there. It's called the insula. The insula. All right, so it's just slightly deeper than these other ones. Right? So these are the 5 major, lobes of the cerebrum. And notice that we have a right and the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. So we can talk about the right temporal lobe or the left temporal lobe, the right frontal lobe or the left frontal lobe. right? So we got a right and left. And in order to be able to coordinate between right and left, there's going to be connections between the right and left hemisphere. All right, so some of the other structures, gyri, sulci, and fissures. So gyri are going to be these peaks. So here are gyri. So the peaks in those folds and undulations. Right? So gyrus is singular, gyri is plural. The valleys, so here I only drew one. This is a sulcus, singular, or sulci, plural. A really deep valley is a fissure. So here we could call this guy a fissure. So we got a gyri or sulcus, and then really deep is a fissure. It might be. There's flexure. There's another term too. But here with the brain, what you can see is you have these folds in the cerebrum, and so here the indentations. So the ones that aren't so deep, those are all the sulci. And notice that in between a sulcus, we have two gyri, right? Okay. Now, an example of a fissure would be, say, what separates the right and left hemisphere here. Okay. So this would be like a fissure. All right. Okay. This would be a fissure. Okay. These other kind of shallower valleys are going to be sulci, and then if you have two valleys, then you have a gyrus in the middle, right? So peaks and valleys. Everybody clear on that? Is that making sense to folks? The terminology here? Okay, so not surprisingly, just like when we looked at the spinal cord for anatomy, we have gray and white matter. Okay, so we have gray and white matter. So what are we finding in white matter? Myelinated axons. Same thing as in the spinal cord, right? Gray matter, we're going to find what structures of neurons in there. Yeah, so dendrites, cell body, and so forth, right? So it turns out the cerebrum we can break up into gray and white matter. In this case, we call the gray matter of the cerebrum the cortex. So the cerebral cortex is really the gray matter. And where that is located, okay, is this surrounding. So it's kind of the edge, the superficial part of the cerebrum, okay, is what is the cerebral cortex. The deeper structures inside of here, the deeper structures in here is where we have the white matter. Okay, so here, this is what we have, where we have connections. The axons are going from one place in the cerebral cortex to another place, perhaps in the opposite hemisphere, right? So we could say the contralateral hemisphere. So remember that terminology before when we talked about reflexes? Ipsilateral and contralateral. Contralateral means that, the destination's opposite of the origin, right? Okay. So when we talk about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about kind of this outer layer here, right? These the deeper part is where we have some of the white matter. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay. So here's a frontal or a coronal section of the brain. So just to orient you, so this is part of the cerebellum. And then what are these two openings here? Anybody remember what those are? Yeah. 1 and 2 what? Start with the V, ventricles, right? So these are lateral ventricles. And then notice they're connected to the third ventricle here. And then this is going to be connected to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. So it's another view of the ventricles. Before we had a view that was from the lateral side. Here we've taken a frontal section and now we're having a frontal view of this. Now you can see here the sulci, and then this would be a what? Gyrus, right? This is our fissure. Okay? Notice that we have tracks connecting the two hemispheres. Okay? Right? So, digging a little bit deeper, now that you guys are familiar with the terms sulcus, sulci, fissures, and gyri, we can use some of these as landmarks for where one lobe ends and another begins. So if we take a look at the brain, okay, the frontal lobe ends at this, what we call the central sulcus. Right? So there's a sulcus that runs down, and this is our frontal lobe. Just posterior to that, central sulcus, is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe. So central sulcus, and then the gyrus just before it is called the precentral gyrus. Not surprisingly, the gyrus just posterior to it is called the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus. These are going to be important structures that we're going to talk about for sensory input and motor output. So these terms you guys are going to hear over and over again. Okay? All right. So what separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe is this lateral sulcus. If we separate or we pull apart the lateral sulcus, we can take a look and see the insula in there. All right? So that's where the insula is located. The occipital lobe is in the back, and then we have the cerebellum down here, and then brainstem, which includes the pons and the medulla oblongata. Now this is a gross oversimplification of, or figuring out how the brain works, or at least the cerebral cortex. But I think it's a good starting point for folks that haven't seen functional areas of the brain. So we could break up into probably two broad categories, these areas of the brain. And these areas can be located in different lobes. So lobes are more anatomical distinctions. These are going to be more functional distinctions. So the two categories are primary and association. In many cases, the word primary and association are in the name of that area, but not always. So here, the further separating these, we can talk about sensory and motor. So here, with primary areas that are sensory, this is where that sensory signals are received. So sensory signals are received in the primary sensory areas. Now, your interpretation and identifying what that sensory information is telling you, consciously figuring out what it's telling you, is being done in the association areas. So the route of information is coming from your sensors to your spinal cord, routed up to your brain, to a primary sensory area, and then from the primary sensory area to an association area for you to identify what is this object that you're feeling in your pocket or your purse, for instance. Okay? So association areas, the words you need to think about with association areas are identification and also interpretation. The primary areas are just routing places for where that sensory information is coming into the cerebral cortex. All right? The motor part is putting together, so if we have a primary motor, it means that we're putting together a plan for that movement. And then the motor, motor association area is where we integrate inputs to execute a plan for movement. All right, so here we have assembly of a plan, and then we have dissemination of that plan. Okay. Now we kind of have a specialized area in our brains called the prefrontal cortex. So that's the very anterior part of the frontal lobe. And a lot of the functions associated with this part of the frontal lobe are called what largely termed executive function, meaning that they're involved with reasoning, judgment, and so forth. All right, so we have primary areas and association areas for a variety of inputs and outputs for our brain. So the main one that's involved with somatosensory information, so it's also known as the primary somatosensory cortex. This is the one taking in sensory information, say, from our fingertips. Okay? So whenever we're talking about somatosensory, we're talking about generally peripheral sensory information. Where is that located? It's located in the post-central gyrus, right? So it's located in this post-central gyrus. And so here, it's telling, there's information coming in about, all right, you know, what do I feel? Okay. What type of information am I feeling if I put my hand in my left pocket, right, and I'm feeling a coin? Okay. So it's telling you what are you feeling. That sensory information is coming in that area. Be able to identify, interpret that information, though, it goes to an association area. Not surprisingly, we also have a destination for visual input. So we have some place called the primary visual cortex. That's located on the occipital lobe. All right. We also have a destination for where auditory information is coming in, and that's going to be located in the temporal lobe. Not surprisingly, we also have an area where we get sensory information from our olfactory neurons, our nose, and that's located also in the temporal lobe. So gustatory, this is taste. So primary sensory is going to be located in the insula, which is the deep portion. So if we were to pull this apart, it'd be the deep portion. And then we also get input from our viscera to some degree, and that's also located in the insula, that kind of deeper lobe. If we were pulling apart this lateral sulcus, we'd be able to see. Now, what does vestibular refer to? Anybody know? Anybody hear this term before? What's that? Balance, yeah. It's balance, equilibrium, right? So what's the main organ that's really important for conveying that information? The ears, yeah, so the inner ear. So we'll talk about it when we get to special senses. So our ears are important not only for hearing, but also for balance and equilibrium. And so here we have an area that sensory information is going to that's also located in the insula. So when we say the primary vestibular area, I'm talking about balance and equilibrium. All right. Okay. All right, so this is kind of a bit of a review of what we just talked about, the lobes and areas. All right, so like I said, if you pulled back that lateral sulcus and you peeked in between there, you would see the insula, and that's where you're going to see the primary gustatory cortex. Here we have our frontal lobe, and we have the primary motor cortex here. We have our primary sensory cortex, right? Generally speaking, usually the primary area for whatever is being, whatever that information is, or whatever it's dealing with, the association area is in close proximity to it, generally speaking. So not surprisingly, the primary motor cortex, we have the motor association area next to it, right? Here, we have the primary sensory cortex, and we have the association area right next to it. Here we have the visual cortex, we have the visual association area right next to it. Okay, so here, broadly breaking up the primary and association areas, we can see that they're anatomically usually in close proximity to each other. Now remember, what's the primary area doing? What's the association area doing? Well, the primary area is the one that is, if it's a primary sensory area, it's receiving information. If it's a sensory association area, it's interpreting that or identifying that information. If it's a primary motor area, it's going to be dealing with formulating a plan, and if it's a primary association area, it's going to be involved with generating a plan, and then the primary motor area is going to be sending out that plan. All right. Okay, so I think this is a good place to stop, right? And so we'll stop here, and then we'll continue our discussion with looking at the rest of the cerebrum as well as some of the other structures on Monday.